The cafe pulsed with the easy rhythm of a Saturday afternoon, the boardwalk alive with the mix of sea breeze, fried food, and the scattered laughter of tourists who'd come to watch the ocean glow under the falling Sunday. Plates clattered, silverware chimed against glasses, and seagulls circled overhead like shameless thieves waiting for scraps. At the far edge of the patio, a man sat alone, his chair angled toward the horizon as though the tide itself had summoned him. His shirt sleeves were rolled carefully to the elbow, his forearms resting lightly on the table, and there, exposed in the shifting light, lay the faint shadow of ink. The lines were blurred, etched long ago into skin that had weathered decades of sun, salt, and years heavy with memory. At another table, half a dozen Marines on leave leaned back in their chairs, fresh uniforms traded for jeans, and fitted t-shirts that still carried the posture of discipline. They were loud in that effortless way youth allows, tossing jokes like darts, jostling one another over drinks, their laughter spilling into the hum of the crowd. One of them noticed the old man, his gaze drawn not to the stillness of his presence, but to the faded tattoo curling across his forearm. He nudged his buddy, pointed, and smirked. "Look at that," he said, the words meant to carry. "It's just a tattoo, old man." The remark sliced through the cafe's noise with casual cruelty. The others erupted, some in laughter, others in awkward chuckles meant to smooth the edges. A couple of them avoided looking at the man at all, suddenly intent on their glasses or the ocean view beyond the railing. Yet the sound hung in the air, heavier than anyone expected. The old man didn't move. He didn't flinch, didn't lift his head, didn't return fire with sharp words or hardened glare. His silence was deliberate, carved out of something deeper than pride. He stared out past the boardwalk, past the bobbing ships in the harbor, eyes fixed on a horizon only he could truly see. The ink on his arm, to him, was not decoration, it was a reminder. A code written in pain and loyalty, sealed in sweat and blood long before the men who mocked him had even drawn their first breath. For a moment, the silence wrapped around the table of Marines, their laughter faltering as they realized the old man wasn't going to rise to their bait. He wasn't going to justify himself, wasn't going to let their youth dictate his worth. The stillness of his posture, the steady line of his jaw, said more than any retort could. But the meaning of it, the gravity slipped past them. They only saw an old body in a chair, ink faded to obscurity. One of the Marines shifted uneasily, tugging at his drink, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Another elbowed him, muttering something about moving on, about the next bar down the street, about the night being too young for dwelling on strangers. The sound of a jukebox kicking on down the boardwalk filled the gap, strumming out an old tune that didn't belong to them. The old man sat unmoved. The tattoo remained, an unspoken story marked into his skin, waiting for someone who understood. His silence carried weight, but in that moment, among the laughter and the dismissive smirks, it went unnoticed like a storm building far out at sea, invisible to those who only cared about the sunshine above their heads. The laughter had dulled into small murmurs, a nervous residue that clung to the group of Marines as they stole glances toward the old man again. The ink on his arm, once the butt of an easy joke, now seemed to demand closer inspection. The lines were not the curved barbs of anchors or eagles they expected, not the familiar emblems of service they all wore proudly on their own skin. Instead, the tattoo was a sequence numbers, symbols, marks etched with mathematical precision rather than flair. It wound across his forearm like a cipher, faded but intact, a secret language that seemed to whisper from beneath the years. One of the younger Marines leaned forward, his grin crooked, curiosity mingling with arrogance. "What even is that?" he muttered, more to himself than to the old man who still refused to acknowledge them. He squinted, tracing the digits in the air with his finger, mouthing the sequence under his breath. Another Marine joined him, laughter breaking in again as if to reclaim the earlier ease. "Looks like someone got drunk and let their buddy play connect the dots with a needle," he said, shaking his head. But curiosity lingered, Phones were pulled from pockets, screens glowing as searches began. "Hold on," one of them said, his voice carrying more focus than mockery now. He tapped furiously, entering fragments of numbers, trying combinations, refining terms, and then his hands froze, his posture straightened. The grin dissolved from his face, replaced by a stillness that unsettled the others. "What?" one of his friends asked, leaning closer. He didn't answer at first. His eyes were locked on the screen, on the words that had leapt from obscurity into undeniable truth. He turned the phone so the others could see. The sequence wasn't random. It wasn't drunken scribble or fading decoration. It was a code, a designation tied to a marine company that history remembered in blood and ash. A unit sent into one of the fiercest battles in modern memory, where survival was measured not by victory but by endurance. Whispers spread around the table. The tone shifted from jest to unease. The name of the battle carried weight even among them, men who had fought their own wars, who had seen their own share of destruction. But this was different. This was legend etched in flesh. A campaign studied in classrooms, retold in hushed tones by instructors who knew better than to cheapen it with theatrics. The old man remained silent, his gaze still fixed on the horizon, as though the unfolding recognition behind him were as inevitable as the tide. His skin was parchment, his body the archive, the scars along his knuckles and the ridges across his arms telling stories more enduring than words. The tattoo was not a boast, it was a record. A living cipher that spoke of codes carried in the field, of signals passed in chaos, of men who fought in shadows so others might stand in light. One Marine swallowed hard, his earlier bravado shrinking beneath the weight of what they had stumbled into. He looked at the man differently now, not as an old relic at the edge of a cafe, but as a living witness to something too large to dismiss. The air thickened, charged with the realization that they were not staring at ink. They were staring at history, alive, breathing, and seated quietly among them. The silence grew. None of them dared laugh again. The hush around the table deepened until it pressed against the noise of the boardwalk itself, swallowing laughter, muffling conversation. Even the gulls seemed to circle in wider arcs, their cries fading into the salt air. The young Marines sat caught between disbelief and dawning recognition, their eyes flicking from the faded tattoo to the glow of the phone screen that confirmed what none of them had expected. Their mockery had died in their throats, replaced by something heavier, something they did not yet know how to name. The scrape of boots against the wooden planks broke the silence. From the edge of the cafe, a figure moved toward them, broad-shouldered, squared jaw, his presence commanding without a word. A senior Marine, his khakis pressed, his chest ribboned with rows of service. He had been drawn not by curiosity, but by the shifting atmosphere, the unmistakable electricity of respect beginning to take shape. His gaze landed on the old man, then fell to the tattoo, and in that instant his stride faltered. His eyes widened, recognition hitting him like a physical blow. Without hesitation, he stopped in front of the table. His spine locked into perfect posture, heels clicked together, and his hand rose in a sharp salute. The gesture cut through the air like a blade, crisp and deliberate, a soldier's language that needed no explanation. The young Marines froze, caught between confusion and awe as they watched one of their own, one ranked above them, seasoned and battle-hardened honor a man they had dismissed only moments earlier. The old man turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting the salute. For the first time since the exchange had begun, there was movement in his expression, a slow, steady acknowledgement that carried no vanity, only quiet acceptance. He lifted his hand, the one lined by veins and years, and returned the salute, not crisp, not perfect, but powerful enough to silence the last of the lingering doubts. "What the hell?" one of the younger Marines whispered, his voice barely audible. The senior Marine lowered his hand, but his stance remained rigid. His eyes, still locked on the tattoo, seemed to travel back through time. When he finally spoke, his voice carried both reverence and weight. "That mark," he said, his tone steady, "is not just ink, it's a code. A signal carried into battle when radios failed, when orders were lost in the chaos. That tattoo belonged to men who decided life and death in places most of us have only read about. The words landed like thunder. The table of Marines shifted uncomfortably, the earlier bravado stripped from them. Their eyes now held the glimmer of something raw: respect, humility, perhaps even shame. Around them, the cafe had quieted. Conversations slowed, utensils stilled. Strangers leaned subtly closer, sensing without knowing that something sacred was unfolding in their midst. The senior Marine continued, his voice firm but reverent. Those numbers, that sequence, they belonged to a unit that walked into hell and didn't all walk back out. They carried the code when others fell. They held it when it was the only thing between survival and annihilation. Men with that mark weren't just soldiers. They were the signal, the lifeline. He glanced at the old man again, his jaw tight, his eyes softened by respect. And he, the senior Marine added, is one of them. The silence that followed was absolute. The young Marines could no longer meet the old man's gaze directly. Their earlier laughter now seemed like sacrilege, an insult hurled against something they hadn't understood. The crowd felt it too, the shift from ordinary afternoon to a moment weighted with history. Phones lowered, chatter ceased. For a breathless span of time, everyone present seemed to stand on the same invisible ground, caught between past and present, between the fading ink of memory and the living proof seated in their midst. No one laughed again. The sound that replaced it was the sound of reverence, unspoken but undeniable. Chairs scraped against the wooden boards, the sound sharp and sudden against the hush that had settled over the cafe. One Marine pushed back from the table, his movements stiff, deliberate, as though compelled by something greater than himself. His boots struck the ground with purpose as he rose, spine straightening, chin lifting. A beat later, another followed, then another, until the table of young men stood together, the weight of their decision echoing louder than any laughter had before. The air carried a new rhythm now. Boots clicked in unison as they moved, one after the other, forming a line before the old man. The senior Marine remained at their head, his jaw set, his stance unwavering. The tourists nearby had stopped pretending not to watch. Conversations died mid-sentence. Children clutched at their parents' sleeves, their wide eyes fixed on the quiet formation taking shape. The old man, who had spent the entire confrontation in silence, finally lifted his head. His gaze swept the line of Marines before him. Eyes young and untested met eyes worn and weathered, and in that exchange lived generations of unspoken stories. His face revealed little, but his eyes, deep, shadowed, steady, held everything. They carried decades of memory, of men lost and battles survived, of promises whispered in the dark and names carved into his heart that time had never erased. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. The silence between him and the line of Marines carried a weight beyond words. As one, the Marines raised their hands in salute. The motion was sharp, clean, and unbroken, every angle precise, every breath suspended. To them, it was no longer a gesture of rank or duty. It was recognition. It was apology. It was honor paid where honor was owed. The old man's hand rose slowly, deliberately, returning the salute with a steadiness that belied his years. The faded ink on his arm caught the sunlight, no longer a mark of curiosity or ridicule, but a banner. A code. A story written into his very skin. It spoke louder now than any voice could. The line stretched longer as Marines from nearby tables stood to join. Some were strangers, some companions, but all felt the pull of the moment. Their chairs clattered back, their boots struck the wood, and soon the line extended beyond the cafe itself, spilling onto the boardwalk. The formation grew not out of obligation, not out of orders, but out of reverence. Out of the unshakable recognition that they were standing in the presence of something eternal. The crowd around them fell into stillness. No one cheered. No one clapped. They simply watched, hushed, as if afraid to disturb the gravity of what they witnessed. The sun slid lower, its light catching the edges of medals, of tattoos, of scars both visible and hidden. The old man lowered his hand at last, his salute completed. The Marines followed in perfect unison, but none of them moved away. They remained there, standing before him, not as superiors or subordinates, but as brothers in a lineage larger than themselves. Some symbols never fade, no matter how blurred by time. Some codes, once carried, are written forever not in ink, but in memory, in sacrifice, in the unbreakable bond between those who know what it means to endure. And in that moment, beneath the fading sun, every man there understood it. The line was not for show, it was for history, it was for him, it was for all of them.